She received her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. And 22 years ago, she was a teaching assistant here in this very room. How about that? She's an award-winning researcher and professor at Texas Christian University with expertise in women, health, and human sexuality. And her research integrates three fields: biology, psychology, and neuroscience. That's a really diverse set of fields to bring together. And what Dr. Hill and her colleagues do is they study the role that hormones and our immune system and the environment all play in our relationships and in our health. Yeah, she's an in-demand speaker. TED Talks, The Today Show, and many others. When she was on The Today Show, turns out she was in the green room, which was really small, and everyone was like packed together. And one of the other stars of The Today Show that was being interviewed was none other than, well, who do you think it might have been? Anybody know? Justin Bieber. How did you know that, Steve? You heard us talking. Sarah Hill and the Biebs. Wow. So she's a very in-demand speaker. We're lucky to have her here tonight. Please welcome Dr. Sarah Hill.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you guys for coming. It's a Friday night, and I really appreciate you all coming out. I'm excited to talk to you guys today about your brain and birth control and being back at my alma mater. It's been so great to be walking around on campus, and I was hanging out in the psych building yesterday, and what a wonderful place we are. And so anyway, thank you for sharing this with me to get to come home to my intellectual birthplace. So today we're going to be talking about birth control, and I want to start this out by saying something that goes almost without saying, but I think it's worth pointing out, right? It's worth repeating, and that is that the birth control pill, or hormonal contraception in general, right, has been absolutely amazing for women, right? It has, by allowing women to be able to choose if and when they get pregnant, right? It has allowed women to dream bigger and to achieve more than even the most optimist feminist would have ever dreamed possible like 50 years ago, right? And just to give you an example of this, I want you to look at this figure here, which illustrates for us the proportion of female applicants to law and medical school in prior to 1970, which was when the birth control pill became legally available to single women, right? And the proportion of applicants was 1 in 10, right? So just 10% of applicants to law and medical school were female. You flash forward just 20 years later, after it becomes legally available to single women, and all of a sudden you have 40% of applicants being female. And currently, female applicants are the majority applicant to law and medical school, right? And so rather than making women reckless or irresponsible, the way that some people would want to argue, right, by having access to birth control pills, instead what it's done is it's allowed women to plan, right? And when women can plan, women achieve, right? And when women achieve, they don't need to be economically or politically dependent on men, right? And so the birth control pill has been really pivotal in terms of the advancement of women and the reason that a lot of us are able to be in this room today, right? But with the birth control pill, there are some trade-offs that you're making, right? And a lot of times the trade-offs that a person is making when they go on hormonal birth control are things that they don't really even know that they're making trade-offs on, right? I know this was the case for me. I was on hormonal birth control for more than a decade of my life, and I never spent a minute thinking about anything that it was doing to any part of my body other than my ovaries. And even then, I was only thinking about it very superficially, just in terms of, okay, this is making it so I don't ovulate, and so I'm not going to get pregnant, right? And so that was the only thing I really thought about, without thinking about the wider range of trade-offs that a person makes when they suppress their hormone production and supplant it with a synthetic. And like I said, I never spent any time thinking about it, and it was really only after a series of unrelated events happened that I began to really dig into what is it exactly that the birth control pill does, right? And the first of these events is that I went off of the birth control pill. So after I had been on it for more than a decade of my life, I went off of it. And I didn't go off of it because I was having any problems, right? I didn't feel depressed, right? I didn't notice that there was anything wrong. I just went off of it because my partner had a vasectomy, and it so no longer became necessary to be on it. And so I walked away from the birth control pill without making any, thought about how this was going to affect me or the way that I felt. But flash forward about 3 months later, and I started to realize that I was feeling like a different person, right? I felt like I woke up. It was like I went from a two-dimensional black and white line drawing, and I feel like I was walking out and emerging into like three-dimensional, colorful reality. Everything just felt more real, right? I had more energy. My sexual desire was back in ways that it really hadn't been in a long time. I found that I was starting to cook again, and I was downloading new music for the first time in years. I was going to the gym, and I was just like, that's really interesting. I feel so awake and energetic and alive. I wonder if that has something to do with the fact that I went off the birth control pill. But then I had the thought that women often do when we have something that goes on with relation to a medication, right? The thing we've all been reinforced to do by the medical system, which oftentimes tells us that it's all in our heads. I thought, it's all in my head, right? So I just kind of pushed it aside and moved on with my life, feeling more vibrant and alive than I had prior. Now, fast forward a few years later, and you'll find me sitting in a room not unlike this one at a research conference. And my friend and co-author, Bruce Ellis, who's a researcher who studies stress, he was giving a research presentation on the impact of early life trauma on the functioning of the stress response in adulthood. And as he was talking about his research and was talking about the data collection and talking about the way that they analyze their data, he mentioned that although they had collected data on about 700 participants, they only analyzed the data they collected from men because, as it turned out, most of the women that were in their study were using hormonal birth control. And everybody knows that women who are using hormonal birth control don't have a cortisol response to stress. It's like, wait, what? What? And so he went on to talk about I don't know what the results of the study were, right? Because I stopped paying attention because all of a sudden it was like I had realization after realization. It was like brain Velcro to me. I was like, what do you mean women who are using hormonal birth control don't release stress hormones? And then I remembered my own experiences when I discontinued birth control. And it was just like realization after realization started flooding into my head. I was just like, I'm a psychologist. I know how hormones affect people. Hormones are being changed by the birth control pill. Like when you take the birth control pill, it suppresses your hormones and replaces it with other ones. Hormones affect the brain, right? Hormones affect the way that we think and feel and experience the world, right? They're a part of who we are. So of course, I felt different when I went off of hormonal birth control. Of course, the birth control pill is going to change stress hormones. Pill changes, this really important stuff that goes on in the brain. The pill, it changes everything. And so it was after this conference where I sat there gobsmacked by the fact that I didn't realize, as somebody who's a researcher who studies women and the brain and has published research papers on the effects of women's sex hormones on motivational systems, the idea that I'd never made this connection before this research talk is really embarrassing, right? But nonetheless true. And so I went back to my research lab and I began to download every paper that was available. And I began to dive into the science behind what we know and don't know about the effects of hormonal birth control on the brain and on women, right? And today I'm going to be telling you about some of the things that I learned, on which I also write about in my book. Right, and the first thing that you need to know when we start to dive into the different ways that hormonal birth control or the pill changes people is that you need to appreciate the fact that we are our hormones, right? So even though we tend to think about our hormones only like when we get a badly timed pimple, right, or when we're thinking about our periods, Hormones are more than just something that happens during pregnancy and puberty, right? Hormones are a part of the signaling machinery that creates the experience of being the person that you are, right? Who you are is a product of things like the synaptic patterns in your brain, neurotransmitters, and also your hormones, right? And so your very sense of who you are and the way you experience the world is colored by your sex hormones. Right? And this is especially true when we're talking about hormones and how important they are in terms of creating the experience of who we are. Our sex hormones are among the most important. And the reason for this is that we've inherited a brain that is wired for sex, right? And if you're a woman, you're also wired for pregnancy. And so you have a brain that is got receptors for sex hormones on every major structure, right? There's nowhere in the brain that isn't touched by sex hormones, including, outside of the brain and the rest of the body as well, right? And so for women, when we talk about this idea that we are our hormones and that our sex hormones matter, this is particularly true for our two primary sex hormones, which are estrogen and progesterone. And so now I'm going to orient you to this little cycle map that you may have seen. I'm going to take you back to like high school health class, right? Where you have to learn about the menstrual cycle, right? You're falling asleep. And so here's your reminder. This is a 28-day menstrual cycle, all right? So an average menstrual cycle is about 28 days long. Of course, they vary in length, but we're just gonna stick to the 28-day one for simplicity. And the menstrual cycle starts on day 1, and day 1 is the day that a woman first gets her period, right? And that's why your doctor, if you're a female, will always say, what is the first day of your last period? Because they're trying to orient themselves to your cycle, right? And so the first day of your cycle is the day that you get your period. And at this time, both of women's primary sex hormones, estrogen, which is this hormone in red, and progesterone, which is the hormone in dark blue, both of these hormones are very low when women get their periods, right? So even though people like to give women a hard time when they're on their period, right, and say, oh, you're hormonal. No, I'm not. I am not. And in fact, that's probably the problem, right? And the problem is that I'm not hormonal, right? So women's hormones are very low. And then what happens is your egg follicles are getting stimulated. Your brain is telling your ovaries to stimulate egg follicles. And as they begin to develop, they release the sex hormone estrogen. And so this is our primary sex hormone here that we see in red. And estrogen increases as an egg gets ready to mature and is getting ready to be released at ovulation. And so right prior to ovulation, which on average happens on day 14, so 2 days after the start of your menstrual cycle is usually when you can project somewhere around then is when ovulation is going to occur. And that, of course, is when the egg is released from the ovary and makes its magical journey down the fallopian tube, right? So here you have estrogen levels rising, 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 rising. And during this time in cycle, it's also known as this is known as the fertile window. So about 5 days prior to ovulation and then on the day of ovulation itself, during this time, sex can lead to conception, right? Then the egg is released, estrogen levels fall, and they stay pretty low during the second half of the cycle. And in this second half of the cycle, after an egg has been released, that empty egg follicle actually turns into a temporary endocrine structure, and it's called the corpus luteum, but you don't need to know that. But what it does, it releases women's second primary sex hormone, which is the sex hormone progesterone, right? And this phase in the cycle, which is called the luteal phase, is a time when sex cannot lead to conception, right? And so we have this, this big rise in estrogen, and it's related to, the ability to conceive from sex. That crashes, and then you get a big rise of progesterone, which is this hormone that's preparing the body for the possibility of implantation in pregnancy. And during this time, sex cannot lead to conception. And this is the way that the cycle changes for a naturally cycling woman, right? And these hormonal changes affect the way that women feel. So there's been a lot of research in neuroendocrinology over the last several decades looking at the relationship between women's two primary sex hormones and women's experiences in the world. So how does this make women feel and how does it make women behave? And what we tend to see is that estrogen, because it's released at a time in the cycle when sex can lead to conception, lo and behold, right? This hormone is kind of shifts women's psychology in a way that's oriented towards sex, right? And we know from research that when estrogen is high across the cycle, this is related to an increase in sexual desire. So women think about sex more, they masturbate more, they have more sex. So it's a sexier time in the cycle for women. We know that from research that for heterosexual women that they have an increase in attention to men. So they notice men, they're more easily distracted by men, and they're more just interested in men. Their mate preferences focus more on cues related to sexiness and physical attraction than they do on some of the other qualities that women also value in their partner choice. It's related to increased energy and reduced appetite. So women generally eat less and move more during the estrogenic phase of the cycle. And they also have higher levels of competitive motivation. Women generally feel more competitive during this time and are motivated to compete. Progesterone, on the other hand, again, which is the hormone that we release in the second half of the cycle, this is released during a time when sex cannot lead to conception. And again, this is a time when the body is kind of shifting all of its energy toward the possibility of implantation and pregnancy. And so what we see is that our psychology and our behavior shifts in ways that are consistent with this goal. And what we see is that during this phase in the cycle, the luteal phase, when progesterone is high, that women tend to be sleepier, they have lower sexual desire, and they have a decrease in competitive motivation. They tend to be more communal and are more interested in time with their family and time with their friends. They have increased appetite, so they're hungrier. Their mate preferences tend to focus more on provisioning and parenting qualities rather than those sort of physical attractiveness, sexiness cues that we see that women tend to prioritize when estrogen is high. And then greater emotional sensitivity, with women being more in tune with emotions and then also more in tune and emotional themselves, right? And so this, of course, when we're on birth control, changes, right? And so this here, again, is our natural cycle. And again, this is estrogen is high during the first half of the cycle, and then it falls. And then during the second half of the cycle, you get this rise in progesterone, our other hormone. And for a naturally cycling woman, you do sort of go through this waxing and waning of these two different hormonal states, right? And this is a very different experience than what's experienced by women on hormonal birth control, right? Because when you take hormonal birth control, it shuts down your own hormone production. So it essentially sends a message to your brain that tells your brain not to stimulate your ovaries to produce eggs, right? And instead, you take a pill, or you get a shot, or you have an implant, or you have an IUD that's giving a hormonal message, but your body is receiving the same daily hormonal message every day. And that message is one of low levels of estrogen, that's down here, and relatively high levels of synthetic progesterone, or what's known as a progestin. And the reason that it works this way is because progesterone, or progestins, they tell the brain, hey, you just ovulated, right? And if you just ovulated, you don't want to start maturing new egg follicles again, because you need to wait and see whether or not the one that you just released is going to implant. And so sometimes you'll hear people say that birth control fools your body into thinking that it's pregnant, and that's not really true. It fools your body into thinking that you've just ovulated, right? And so it doesn't stimulate your egg follicles. They don't stimulate, they don't get developed, they don't get released, you don't get pregnant, right? But this, of course, means that women who are taking hormonal birth control are going to be experiencing the world differently than women who are not, right? And it's only very recently that researchers have thought to ask that question, right? Given that we know that women's hormonal changes are also related to changes in the way that women think and feel and experience the world, then how does birth control change women, right? How does it make us feel? And so now I'm going to tell you about some of the research and talk about some of the things that we currently do know, although what we know is a lot less than what we don't know about the ways that the pill can change women. And we'll start by talking about changes in sexual desire and attraction, right? And as you may know, if you know somebody who's been on the pill or you've been on the pill yourself, many women experience diminished libido and sexual functioning on the pill. Right, and in some ways, this is like one of the greatest ironies of our time, right? That this drug that you take to facilitate sex makes you not want to have it, right? And in fact, I had a friend who once told me that she was utterly convinced that the way that her birth control worked was by making her just not want to have sex. She's like, this is great at keeping me non-pregnant because I don't ever want to have sex. So, who's going to get pregnant that way? And this is a very common situation, right? It's very common for women to experience sexual side effects, both in terms of desire, so the desire for sex, but also sexual function, right? So the ability even to climax is something that can get impacted for some women. Sexual functioning in terms of having a physiological sexual response can also be decreased in response to birth control. And the reason for this is because of the hormonal changes that are initiated by birth control use, right? And so what we know about women's sexuality is that it is fueled by two hormones, right? And the big hormone is estrogen. And we talked about the fact that when estrogen is rising and conception is possible, during that time, women experience a sharp increase in sexual desire, right? And evolution by natural selection would have it no other way, right, than to have a brain that wants to have sex when sex is going to lead to gene transmission, right? And so we know that estrogen fuels the female sexual response. So too does testosterone. So testosterone plays a really important role in female sexual function in addition to male sexual function. And so these are the hormones that are good for sex. And progesterone is actually sexually antagonistic. So research finds that it is associated with a decrease in sexual desire. And it's been hypothesized that this might be true because progesterone is high during that phase in the cycle when sex cannot lead to conception and the body is actually preparing for the possibility of implantation of an embryo. And during that time, having high inflammatory activity in the reproductive tract could potentially be sort of suboptimal for implantation. And so it's been hypothesized that this might be a reason that progesterone is associated with lower desire. But for whatever reason, it is, which is also why sometimes women will experience an increase in sexual desire when they get their period, because as soon as progesterone falls, they feel better, right? They feel more sexually aroused. And so this is female sexuality, right? Good for sex, bad for sex. And here's what happens with the birth control pill. It's essentially a recipe for low sexual desire in women, right? Because the hormones that are kept really low on the pill are estrogen, right? So estrogen levels are kept very low. And women who are on hormonal birth control also release high levels of what's known as sex hormone binding globulin. And what sex hormone binding globulin likes to do is it likes to glom onto testosterone and make it inactive. And so what we find is that women who are using hormonal birth control have about 60% lower levels of free testosterone relative to non-pill takers, right? So these hormones are really low in women on the pill. And the hormone that's high is the synthetic progesterone or progestins, right? So essentially, it's like the hormones that are bad for sex are high, the hormones that are good for sex are low, and the result of this is, excuse me, that some women have experiences with diminished libido and sexual functioning when on the pill, right? And what research also finds is that when women discontinue birth control, as soon as they start ovulating again and start producing their own hormones, that sexual desire returns with the return of their hormones, right? And so the hormonal package that's created by the pill is not necessarily great for sexual desire. The hormonal milieu that is created by the birth control pill also seems to impact attraction and partner choice, right? And this is something that's very provocative. And to orient you to this idea, I want us to return to our cycle. So we remember our 28-day cycle. And let's talk a little bit about estrogen again. And just as a reminder, estrogen increases right prior to ovulation, and then it crashes after ovulation, and then it's got a little bump at the end, right? And we know that as estrogen increases across the cycle, women's sexual desire increases across the cycle, and as it falls, women's sexual desire falls, right? Research also finds that when estrogen is rising in the cycle, this is also related to a heightened preference for testosterone markers in the faces of men. And so what researchers find is that when estrogen levels are low, women prefer a somewhat less masculinized male face. And then as women become increasingly near to ovulation, the preference for masculinity cues increases along with estrogen. And then again, it falls when estrogen falls, the preference for the testosterone markers in faces also falls. And so this research has lived in the world for a couple of different, for about 20 years now that researchers have been investigating the relationship between women's estrogen levels and both their sexual desire and also their preference for testosterone markers in partners. And so it was only more recently that researchers said, well, if this is all true, then what happens when estrogen levels get flatlined on the birth control pill? So here's what they found. As they predicted that given that women's preference for testosterone markers increases with estrogen across the cycle, they predicted that women who are using hormonal birth control, whose estrogen levels are very low, that they would exhibit a decreased preference for testosterone markers in the faces of men. And that's what they found. They found that if they have women, and this was done as a within subjects design, where they had women coming into the lab, they had them using a sliding scale to create faces, they found that if they did it first when they were naturally cycling, and then they had them do it again after they'd been on birth control for 3 months, what they found was that the women's faces that they created as the ideal male face was slightly less masculinized when they were using hormonal birth control relative to when they're not, right? And these are not huge differences, right? Some of you might look at these faces and say, they look exactly the same to me, right? Some of you might look at them and say, they don't look the same to me. And for those people, you might be near ovulation. And it's funny because in my lab, I had one of my graduate students who said, she's like, I always know if I'm looking at this and I'm ovulating, I can totally see the difference. And if I can't, I don't. And anyway, so if you are like, yeah, I see that, I got you. I know where you are, right? And so what we tend to see is that there's a preference for less facial masculinity. They've also done studies where they've looked at faces of partners that were chosen by women who were either naturally cycling or on birth control. And they had 2 stacks of photographs of the men who were chosen as partners by these 2 different categories of women. They had other people evaluate them for facial masculinity. They also had them evaluated using a computer program that's able to look at certain facial ratios to be able to determine facial masculinity. And they found that indeed, women or partners who were chosen by women who were naturally cycling had more masculinized faces relative to the ones who were chosen by pill takers. There's also research evidence suggesting that women who are using hormonal birth control are less sensitive to testosterone markers with scent. So when testosterone is metabolized, it releases some metabolites that can be detected through scent. And what they find is that women who are using hormonal birth control aren't as sensitive to these. They're not able to detect them at the same low thresholds that naturally cycling women are able to detect them, which again suggests that women who are using hormonal birth control just might not be as attuned to cues related to testosterone in terms of partner choice. There's also some evidence that suggests that because women's sexual desire tends to be dampened when they're using hormonal birth control, that things related to sexual attraction and sexual desire may be deprioritized in partner choice by women who are using hormonal birth control compared to women who are naturally cycling. And what we tend to see in research is that if you look at relationships that are initiated by women who are using hormonal birth control and compare it to relationships that are initiated by women who are naturally cycling, those relationships initiated by pill-taking women tend to be characterized by less sexual attraction and less sexual satisfaction within the context of their relationship, but they're associated with more satisfaction with their partner's provisioning abilities, right? So their partner's financial provisioning, which again suggests that it may tilt or sort of nudge women's mate preferences in ways where they're prioritizing those kinds of qualities relative to the testosterone-related qualities, right? And we've also have evidence from cycle tracking app data So this last study came from my lab. We worked with Natural Cycles, which is a cycle tracking app, and women can track their sexual behavior over the course of the cycle, along with cycle-related characteristics. And what we found is that among our large population of women who are all naturally cycling, so meaning none of them are on birth control right now, about half of them had chosen their partners while using birth control, and the other half had chosen their partners while naturally cycling. And what we found is that the women who chose their partners while they were on birth control, they have less sex across the cycle than the women who chose their partners when they're naturally cycling. And again, this is just consistent with the idea that women who are naturally cycling are sort of more cued in to qualities related to sexual desire, sexual attraction, because again, they have that estrogen surge that predicts those quality, a preference for those qualities, and that this may then have an impact on who they choose as a mate, right? And these results are mixed and variable and need more research, but nonetheless, the evidence seems to suggest that hormonal birth control could have an impact on partner choice. Another area that's been fairly well studied in terms of the relationship between hormonal birth control use and psychological outcomes has to do with mood, right? And some of these mood-related effects are very positive, right? And so if you are somebody who has severe PMS or PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is where you get incredibly depressed, like a very severe depression that occurs during the last week or two in the cycle. For these women, taking hormonal birth control, because it irons out your hormonal fluctuations, can be very palliative to these women, right? It can be very mood stabilizing, and in some cases even life-saving. Women who have PMDD oftentimes have suicidal ideation because they're so depressed. And so taking something that irons out the hormonal changes that seem to be what is triggering PMDD-related symptomology can be very positive. But despite these positive effects, birth control pill can also have some very negative effects related to mood, right? And most women who discontinue hormonal birth control use do so because of side effects. And almost half of women who start hormonal birth control quit within the first 2 months of taking it, right? Because of side effects. A lot of people have bad side effects, right? And the number one negative side effect that leads to discontinuity are mood-related changes, right? And mood-related changes are very common on hormonal birth control, right? And there have been several studies that have demonstrated this now, and I'm just going to show you a little snapshot of some data from one particularly well-done study. This was one that was done in Denmark. And what's cool about this study is that they did this study on the entire population of Denmark, aged 15 to 35, right? So the cool thing about these Scandinavian countries is that they have these health records of every citizen who lives in their nation, right? And so what they're able to do with all of these health records is they're able to do research. And so what they did is they took all of the women of Denmark, ages 15 to 35, and they put them into different bins. Right? Did this person fill prescriptions for hormonal birth control, right, or not, right? And then they wanted to look at, after the people started filling prescriptions for hormonal birth control, what was the probability that they subsequently would get diagnosed with depression, right? And they were able to compare the people who were using hormonal birth control, and they were also able to divide it up among the different types of hormonal birth control and compare it to those women who were not using hormonal birth control. And so I want to orient you, and this is just a snapshot of a few of the different types of birth control that they looked at. They had a ton of different ones on there, and it's a really interesting paper if any of you are interested in looking up your own birth control. I recommend having a peek because they do a really nice job of outlining all of them. But just let me orient you to what this means. This is telling us what is the change in risk of developing depression based on being on this type of birth control, right? So if it's a positive number, it means there's an increased risk. If it's a negative number, it means that there's a lower risk. And if it's 0%, that means that there's no difference in the risk, right? And what they found is that for all women in the sample, so again, ages 15 to 35, that almost every single product that they found was related to a significantly increased risk of developing depression. So just to give you, here's the hormonal birth control patch. There's a 90% increased risk of being diagnosed with depression if you're on this relative to being somebody who's naturally cycling. The vaginal ring, there's a 50% increased risk. The hormonal IUD, there's a 40% increased risk, right? These progestin-only pills, and these are the ones that are available over the counter. Look at the increased risk for depression with these things. 180%, 170%, 220% increased risk. And the reason for this, most birth control are these combined hormonal contraceptive pills that include both progestin and some estrogen. And the estrogen is actually in there primarily because it makes women feel better. Because progestin-only products tend to not make people feel very good, and you can kind of see evidence of this here. Right, and so this was all women. I also want you to orient yourself over here to the right. They did a subsample analysis where they just looked at the risk factor in adolescent women. So these are young users of birth control. And what they found was that these young women were the ones who were asymmetrically, with the exception of these progestin-only products where they had these negative effects sort of across the board. This isn't a typo, by the way, because it looks like it is because of the numbers are the same, pardon me. But you get this much greater increased risk among these really young women by using hormonal birth control products. And this is true not only when it comes to depression, it was also found for anxiety, and it was found for suicide risk. So this was another study that they did using the entire population of Denmark. And what they found is that, if you look at the risk of attempting or successfully dying by suicide based on whether or not you were prescribed hormonal birth control and then, later or not and later, what they found is that the attempted risk of suicide doubled, successful tripled, and that this peaks in the first 2 months after you start, and that is most robust for adolescent women. Right, so again, that 15 to 19-year-old age range seems to be the age range at which women are most vulnerable for the psychological side effects related to hormonal birth control. This is something that's obviously incredibly important and relevant, and something that should probably be taken into consideration when young girls are being prescribed hormonal birth control for things like acne, right, and cramps, right, because this is a very serious outcome. So why does this happen? Well, primarily it has to do with the differences in neurotransmitter activity that happen in response to hormonal birth control use, right? And when I talked about the fact that hormones change everything, right? They have a profound impact on neurotransmission in our brain, and in particular, they have an impact on allopregnanolone, which is it's a neurosteroid that gets released when progesterone is being metabolized in the body. That hormone that we have in the second half of the cycle for naturally cycling women, when that gets broken down in the body, it releases this really nice, soothing neurosteroid that stimulates the GABA receptors in our brain. And GABA receptors in our brain are what gets stimulated when we drink alcohol, right, or sit by the fire in our PJs, right? Or if you take a benzodiazepine like Xanax, that's also your GABA receptors that are being stimulated. It calms down the brain. It's very soothing, and it's really good at balancing and stabilizing mood and promoting mental health. Women who take hormonal birth control, because the progestins that are in there to prevent pregnancy are not made out of progesterone. They're actually synthesized from testosterone, most of them. They don't release allopregnanolone when they're broken down. And so what research finds is that women who use hormonal birth control, they have substantially lower levels of allopregnanolone than naturally cycling women do across the full cycle, right? And so because of this, this can create a situation where the brain is less able to calm itself down, right? Because it's not having this really powerful source of GABAergic activity, which calms the brain and stabilizes mood, right? You also get, in the case of hormonal birth control, reduced serotonin receptor binding potential, right? Estrogen increases the binding potential of serotonin, which just means that we know that serotonin is like a feel-good, hormone, makes us feel good. And when we have low levels of estrogen, it decreases the binding potential, meaning it's not able to get bound up in the brain and have all of its great feel-good effects. and instead it just sort of, goes by the wayside and gets more or less wasted. Other factors contributing to poor mental health outcomes. This is that effect I was telling you about at the very beginning of the presentation, whereby women who use hormonal birth control can have a blunted cortisol response to stress. And at first this might sound like a kind of a good thing, right? Like nobody likes stress, right? And it's like, well, I don't want stress hormones. Like, really? Like, this sounds like a great thing. But it turns out it's really not. So, stress hormones and cortisol, it has a bad reputation because if you have too much of it, it is a bad thing, right? And it's so much of a bad thing that if you are chronically stressed, your body will actually shut down cortisol release because it can be really damaging to the body when it's being released at long stretches at a time. But in short dynamic bursts, like all of us have when we're feeling stressed, so imagine that you're stuck in traffic or you're standing in front of a group of people giving a talk, you get this surge in stress hormones, and this is actually really adaptive, having this surge in stress hormones, right? Because they actually help to do things like they dump fat and sugar into your bloodstream to allow you to be able to make a quick getaway. If there's something like if you're being chased by a bear, right, you're going to be able to do that better. It prompts the birth of new neurons in the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that deals with learning. So that way you can learn about whatever it is that's going on in the stressful context. Right, it does things that help us deal with, learn from, and cope with stress. Right, so cortisol doesn't cause stress, right? Cortisol helps us resolve stress, right? And so not having a cortisol response to stress, that's not good for our ability to be able to feel like we can cope with stress and manage our environment. And not being able to cope with stress, of course, is something that can produce anxiety and can produce depression, right? And we find that women who use hormonal birth control don't release this stress hormone in response to stressful situations. And this is something that is also observed in people who have PTSD or who suffered from trauma during childhood. And it suggests that something about using hormonal birth control use is overacting the stress hormone response, causing it to shut down, and then making women less able to regulate their stress response. Right, and the thing about these mental health related side effects is that for most of the things that we talk about with hormonal birth control use and its effects on the brain and its effects on women, it's about, it happens in sort of now you see it, now you don't fashion, right? Like we talked about the fact, like with sexual desire, for example, as soon as women stop taking hormonal birth control and they start cycling again, they get their sexual desire back, right? Everything goes back to normal. And the same is probably true with respect to mental health in adults, but there's emerging research that suggests that adolescent birth control use may lead to a greater increased risk of developing major depressive disorder over the course of the lifetime, even after you've gone off of it, right? And the reason for this is that sex hormones play a really important role in helping to reorganize the brain from its childlike version of itself into the grown-up version of itself during the pubertal transition. And so going in and shutting down women's sex hormones during that time and then replacing them with the synthetic might not necessarily be doing women's brains favors during development, right? And this might have a lasting impact because this is an organizational effect on the brain, right? It could potentially affect brain development. Right, and this is not where it all ends, right? So the birth control pill, by changing women, this ultimately will end up changing the world because women live in an interconnected web of other people, right? So if we have a pill that changes women and women live in a world that's surrounded by friends and family and romantic partners and coworkers, when we change women, we also change the world. So, we need to start to have more conversations about the birth control pill. Right? And we don't yet know all of the different ways that it changes women's brains and the way that women feel and the way they experience the world. But we know enough to know that it does change women's brains, right? And it does change the way that women feel, right? And we need more research into all of the reasons why and how this works, right? And this isn't to say that we abandon the birth control pill, right? It's been amazing for women, right? Instead, it's about putting the information out there about the different ways that it can affect women into the hands of women, so that way they can make informed choices about their health and who they want to be. So that is the end, and thank you so much for listening to me. We will now take questions.
I'm wondering if the difference between cycling women and women on the hormonal birth control, in the choices of partners that they make, the ones on natural cycling, do they end up having more abusive relationships?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. So I've not seen any research on that, but I have seen research on the fact that the divorce rate is actually higher for women who choose their partners while naturally cycling. And the divorce rate for women who are using hormonal birth control seems to be lower. And again, if we think about the fact that that the research seems to suggest that when women are naturally cycling and they're kind of going between these two states where they're really kind of prioritizing sexy cues and then also prioritizing provisioning and those kinds of cues, whereas women who are on the pill are more focused on the provisioning and those kinds of cues and don't really get tilted in the other direction. I mean, one can sort of speculate about how that might lead to more, sort of choosing somebody less based on partnership, related qualities and more on attraction, and that might be more unstable. But yeah, I don't have an answer to that question, but it's really interesting.
So, yeah, your questions, I'd love to get them, but come to the aisle.
Hey, good to see you again. Thank you for this talk. Really good. So one thing I've been interested in is the literature on women's mate choice based on the MHC and all that kind of data. And of course, there are data showing that when they're on the pill, that attraction for immune complementary genes is flipped. So women would be more attracted to men that actually don't have I wouldn't say the best, but the best quality genes complementary for their immune system.
Right.
I saw a correlational study that showed, again, only correlational, but that if you take couples where the women met the man when she was on the pill versus couples where the woman met when she was not on the pill, the children of the couples where the woman met the man when she was on the pill tend to have more hospital visits and health concerns.
Yeah.
So has it been replicated at all? And what are your thoughts on that as a general?
No, so there was a study that was done that showed that women who chose their partners on the pill, that their children that they had, when they compared these children in their health outcomes to the children of people who were naturally cycling when they chose their partners, that the children of the pill takers were less healthy and have more. And yes, so I've seen that study. I've not seen it replicated, but it is really fascinating. And the mechanism behind this, and the reason that these researchers were even exploring this idea in the first place, is that because it seems that estrogen is very attuned to cues related to whether or not somebody's going to be like a good mate. I mean, just in terms of their genetic, qualities that they have, because it's high during this time when conception is possible. And one of those traits is like whether or not somebody has complementary immune genes to yourself. And there's been research showing that women, especially near ovulation, when fertility is high and estrogen is high, that women are good at being able to pick up on the scent of men who have compatible rather than redundant immune genes. And then there's been some research evidence showing that women who are on the pill aren't sensitive to this, right? And so they don't have this preference for people with different immune genes. And different immune genes tend to lead to better health outcomes for kids for a bunch of reasons I won't bore you with right now. But and so there is that one study. I've just seen that one study, and I haven't seen anything else since. But they did show that the kiddos of the couples where they got together when the woman was on the pill, that they do have more hospital visits and more health problems. That's a really fascinating area of research. We want to, like I said, we've got a research partnership with Natural Cycles and looking at what women were on for birth control, whether it was hormonal birth control or not, and then looking at time to conceive, and then also the rate of pregnancy loss, and seeing whether or not we get differences that way, because that's also something that one could predict given the changes that we get. So yeah, really fascinating question.
Hello, I have two questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned briefly the comparison between combination estradiol and progesterone and just progesterone.
Yes.
are the studies that you're referencing that have mood changes mostly one type or the other?
It's so they found it with all different types, and the risk profile of the different types is different. And so the highest risk profile, like in terms of mental health side effects, are progestin only products. And so the worst one is the shot. Like Depo-Provera's got the highest rate of mental health side effects. The progestin only pill also doesn't do great with that. And then the hormonal IUD for some women, that one's it's messy for reasons. If somebody else asks about it, I might get into the weeds on it. But that one can be sort of that, and the implant. And so those are the ones that are the worst. The lowest risk profile for mental health side effects are combination, just good old fashioned combination hormonal birth control pills.
Thanks. And then my second question, can you speak to how this work intersects with people who are genderqueer or have non-heterosexual orientations?
Yeah, no, that's great. So there's like most things, most of the research that has been done on this has been on anything related to, especially like, partner choice and that sort of thing, has been focused on a, cis hetero population. But I will tell you that the studies that have been done that have included like sort of people with a non-heterosexual sexual orientation, I haven't seen anything outside of cisgendered. I mean, I haven't seen anything on that. But just looking at non-heterosexual sexual orientation, same patterns. And I mean, just in terms of even, like dampening sexual desire in lesbian women, they get lower sexual desire when they're on the pill. And I haven't seen anything in terms of the masculinization of the faces. But usually when we look at heterosexuals and non-heterosexuals with things related to mating, they end up being a lot more similar to one another than a person might expect. Because we're all very similar in the way the different processes work really similarly. And so my expectation would be that it would be very similar. I'm just going to say one quick anecdote, and that is that since I published my book, I get a lot of emails from people. And I've gotten a lot of emails from people who were either bisexual and then all of a sudden went off of the pill, and then they either realized that they're actually obligatorily straight or lesbian, or they're straight or lesbian and now all of a sudden have been nudged into bisexuality. And I think it's so fascinating because it's like we know that sex hormones play a role in sexual orientation. I mean, there's just no question about it. And also even gender identity. And I haven't gotten those emails, but I'm willing to bet that there's some nudging that goes on there with the hormonal nudges that we get from the pill. And so what I think is actually a really cool area for research, like moving forward, is trying to understand how the pill affects not only like the mate preferences of non-heterosexuals, but how it affects like sexual orientation and gender identity. Because I think that, like I said, I've gotten enough of these emails now where people are like, you're never going to believe the story I have to tell you about myself. And then I'm like, no, this is like literally the 10th time I've heard it. So I do believe it. And so, yeah, but really fascinating, really great questions. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I also have two questions. Maybe I'll nudge open the door around the hormonal IUD, because in the study that you showed, it looked like the IUD for the general demographic had the lowest chance, but in younger people it had the highest chance. And I'm wondering, knowing it's not your study, if there's any understanding of that.
Yeah. So that was only your first question, but I've got a two-part answer to your first question. All right. So the first part of the answer is the hormonal IUD releases very, very low levels of hormone. Okay. So we just like keeping that in mind. But for most women who are on it, when they go on it, it shuts down the brain ovarian axis. So like a lot of times doctors will tell women it acts locally. It doesn't act locally. And that's my biggest pet peeve, is that because most 80% of women, up 80+% of women, for the first year they're on it, don't ovulate. And ovulation starts in the brain, and that means that their brain is being told not to ovulate. All right, so here are women who are not ovulating, but this is releasing really low levels of hormone. That is a very weird state for a woman's body to be in, because women are hormonal. I mean, it's like and so to be in that can be really disruptive, particularly during puberty. because that's a time of huge hormonal changes. And so my guess is that it's so bad for these really young girls because that's such it's like an alien state, right? They're during this developmental process that's affected by their sex hormones. Their sex hormones are being shut down and they're not being replaced, because it's these really low levels of hormone. So that's the first part of the answer. Second part of the answer is that the hormonal IUD is messy. And the reason it's messy is, as I just alluded to, when most women start it, 80% do not ovulate. And if you're not ovulating, you're not producing hormones. And when women don't produce hormones, and again, especially when they're not being replaced by anything, they feel pretty weird because women are hormonal. But what happens is by the time women have been on it for like 5 years, if you look at a sample of women who've been on the hormonal IUD for 5 years or more, about 80% of them are ovulating. Okay, so at some point, their brain is like, I don't think that I don't buy this. Like, I don't think that I'm actually ovulating. And so the brain starts stimulating the ovaries again and the women start ovulating. And once women start ovulating again and start producing their own hormones and they're on the IUD, they feel pretty good because we feel pretty good. We're hormonal and that's like a normal way for us to feel. And so it's really messy because everybody is different. Some women will never ovulate when they're on the pill. Some women will be ovulating right away, like they'll put it in and they'll be ovulating. Their brain it never shuts down. And nobody really knows unless they're taking LH tests at home which type they are. And so it's really messy. And anytime that you do a study where you measure women on the IUD, the results are all over the place. And it's because we don't know who these women are. It could be a group of women who've all been on the IUD for 10 years, in which case the rates of depression are probably gonna be really low, because they're ovulating and they're feeling great. And then meanwhile, if you have a big group of people and they all just started, your risk of depression is going to look huge. And so I also think there's some idiosyncrasy that's created from that. So yeah.
Thank you. On the other side of that, I wonder if you can briefly touch on how perimenopause and menopause play into this with hormone. I mean, it could probably be its own lecture, but
right. So the age of menopause isn't affected by birth control at all. And so we know that it doesn't, and a lot of times doctors will give women hormonal birth control as a way to take the edge off the menopausal transition because it is a pretty gnarly time for women as their hormones are going through these big swings, and taking, a contraceptive, which is shutting down her own wild swings and then replacing it with that same daily hormonal message can feel a lot better. But the synthetic progestins in hormonal birth control aren't as necessarily good for the body as a micronized progesterone. And so I guess my only comment about menopause and the menopausal transition and sort of birth control and how all of that goes is that birth control can be palliative, again, for women who are going through the menopausal transition. But a better alternative from my view is estrogen and then micronized progesterone. And the reason I say this, I mean, and of course it depends on whether the woman needs birth control. Because if she needs birth control also, because if you're perimenopausal and you need to prevent pregnancy, then birth control pills great, right? If you don't need to protect yourself from pregnancy, you have a partner who's got a vasectomy or whatever it is, I would say estrogen, micronized progesterone. And the reason for this is progesterone does release that really beautiful neuroprotective metabolite, allopregnanolone, and it has a lot of really great properties that are protective of the brain and help promote brain function and also help stabilize mood. And it also helps with bone growth and it helps with bone density. And so that to me is a sort of a better choice, than hormonal birth control if you don't need protection for pregnancy. But if you do, like I said, the birth control pill, a lot of women, it really can help smooth out that time because it is a gnarly hormonal state. Because your hormones are all over the place and that doesn't usually feel good to anyone either.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was really informative. So from a public health standpoint, I'm just wondering if you know of any resources or support systems for women or adolescents that are affected by the hormonal pill and other stuff like that.
Oh gosh, that's a really great question, and I honestly I don't have a good answer. I think that any mental health professional is obviously going to be important, especially if you're dealing with something like anxiety and depression. So, but no, I don't. Nobody has ever asked me that question, and I know it. Well, no, it's very thoughtful, and I'm disappointed in myself for not having an answer to it, because I think that it would be a great, opportunity to be able to share resources. And and I will say this. So here's the way I'm going to answer the question I'm not prepared to answer, and that is there are almost 100 different formulations of hormonal birth control that are out there. Okay. So if you are on one and you think that you don't love it, or you think it might be making you feel not great, I would just talk to your doctor about finding a new one. Because like I said, and all of us are so different. It's like each one of us in this room has somewhat different hormone receptor numbers, and we metabolize hormones differently, and we're of different body weights, and we're of different, all of these different ethnicities, and all of this stuff impacts the way that we metabolize and then respond to hormones. And I give, there's different ways that birth control pills are kind of categorized. There's different types of progestins in there, and there's 4 different main categories. I talk about this extensively in my book. I didn't have time to go over it in the presentation tonight. But troubleshooting your birth control, if you don't feel right, you can probably, but you want to be on hormonal birth control, you can probably find something that's going to make you feel good. And so just talk to your doctor about troubleshooting. And I would start by troubleshooting the type of progestin. And I'll just make a quick, and I can make a plug for my book, but there's also something for free. I wrote an article called "How to Choose the Least Worst Birth Control," and you can just Google it and you'll be able to pull it up, and it gives you sort of the step by step of what to do and what conversation to have with your doctor. So I would start there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I think by now most of the questions that I had in mind had already been asked, but it's great that you're doing this kind of work and sharing information with the younger generation, especially.
Thank you.
But I would be curious to see what happens next in terms of our understanding of what happens with those that are under the pill or any other birth control, with oocytes.
Right.
And I think someone already asked, and you were mentioning the study for those that were under the pill and their children, and the ones that were not under the pill.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I'm also curious and would be eager to see is for the study where there's a comparison for younger generation, or the younger generation of women and the more broader group, if that's for women that have never been on the pill.
Right.
And also, how can that be used to ask for maybe like a lower dose for the younger women as they're getting started?
Yeah, no, really great question. So I think that the reason that the younger women are tending to get the worst side effects is less about the dose of the hormone, but about the fact that they're in this period of brain development, and their brains are just, primed to soak up sex hormones, because that's like that's a head contractor of the brain remodeling that goes on during puberty. So your brain is just like ready to listen to sex hormones, because that's where it's going to be getting these instructions about how to develop. And so in that type of a context where the brain is just primed to listen, and then all of a sudden you flatline hormones and then just dump on these synthetics, I think, these young girls, obviously their brains aren't handling it very well. And so I don't know that the lower dose piece would be the right answer. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that it's a unique vulnerability that can't be solved that way.
I could see that, but I can also see how, because they're already going through so many changes all at once, by bringing in like a smaller dose at a time might be also beneficial.
Right. Yeah, it may be. So, it's an empirical question. My hunch tells me no, but I could be wrong. Like one thing that I think that a lot of people, there's a misunderstanding that I think that exists in the world about like lower dose birth control. And it's just this idea that oh, well, I'm on this new drug. My doctor said it's a really low dose, so I should feel okay. And it's like, not always. Women aren't, like, we're hormonal. And having really low levels of hormone, doesn't really feel very natural, and instead, it feels, because we're not producing our own hormones. Like most of that, and it's not most, maybe it is most, close to most of the side effects that women get from birth control are from not ovulating, and it's from having these really low levels of hormones and having their ovaries shut down. And so, keeping things low, like it's not that these hormones are synthetic. I mean, there are some of the side effects, especially with the progestin, that are related to that. But it's like low dose isn't always necessarily better, just because that's, again, that's an unnatural state for a female brain to be in.
Thank you.
Okay. So thank you so much. I think this information is very important. And my question has to do around kind of intent and how we're going to move forward with it.
Yes.
So I brought my youngest child, who's 10 here, and we had a big conversation in the car about birth control. We're very open in our family. And so my question would be, is this information being compared to information that might, I don't know, discover how women feel after birth? So I think the big question becomes, is birth control something we continue on? How does it get better? Versus going backwards and saying we want to be natural,
Right.
focus on natural planning, which with the way things are going,
Right,
is a concern.
Right, yeah.
So, I want my daughter to feel empowered. And as a
Right.
parent, if she comes to me at a young age and says, hey, I'm ready to be on birth control, I want to be able to support her.
Right.
But I also, have experience with young mothers and depression, postpartum, memory loss, all of those things happen after pregnancy.
Right.
So how is this correlating with that? And how are we moving with this information forward in a positive direction for women?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, with all of this, it's about, I think for a really long time, everybody has assumed that birth control is solved. It's like, we've got the birth control pill, it's solved, and so the message here is it's not solved. It's like, this isn't perfect. And like, to your point, a lot of these things that we talk about with trade-offs that women make when they're on the pill are a hell of a lot better than the trade-offs you make as a teenage mother, And so it's like, I also have a teenage daughter, and, and so we've had these conversations, and it's like, okay, there are non-hormonal forms of brainless birth control. But like the copper IUD, it does not have hormones, and it's an IUD, which means you don't have to make, remember to do things or take your temperature or whatever else, because the idea of a teenager doing that is completely unrealistic. And so I don't, I think that this is about trying to make everybody understand this is a problem for women. There's nothing more important than being able to regulate our fertility. And how dare, big pharma, they invest almost nothing. Like most drug companies for most categories of drugs will invest about 20% of their sales into R&D. With contraception, it's nothing. There's nothing being invested in right now. It's all private sector things where companies are trying to disrupt birth control. And thank God somebody's paying attention, And so my hope is that this gets women riled up enough where, we start to push for better changes to come up with more options, because the fact is, like, this isn't perfect. And we've all just been willing to put up with it because pregnancy prevention is so important to us. And so, yeah, my hope is the awareness is ultimately going to lead to pressure that leads to development of new technology. But thank you.
So you mentioned how women with like heavy PMS symptoms and PMDD, it makes that easier to deal with. Whereas women who are on the pill also get it's a higher rate of diagnosis of depression, which is very contradictory. Do you happen to know more about that?
Yeah. So women who have like PMDD, right? So if you have that. And usually the thing that causes that is oversensitivity to the hormonal fluctuations. And so when you flatline a woman's sex hormones because they're not moving around, it's incredibly, it helps to support their mental health. It makes them feel better. Now, for women who don't have PMDD and then they go on birth control, you get a greater risk of developing depression than you would if you were somebody who didn't have depression and then didn't go on hormonal birth control. And so it's like, it can lead to different types of effects depending on what your starting psychological state is. But interestingly, women who are at a greater risk for developing mental health related side effects when they're on hormonal birth control, a lot of them have in their family mental health problems, right? So it's not like, most of the people who get mental health side effects have some mental health issue somewhere in their family line. And so they are more uncommon in people without any sort of family history than they are for people with a family history. But those PMDD and PMS and then depression and anxiety, even though they have similar symptomology and they can be comorbid, they're two distinct groups of women who have a different pattern of results.
Thank you.
All right.
Awesome. Have you seen a correlation between infertility and people who've been taking the birth control pill for a long time? Like, say you've been taking the pill for 15 years, you turn 29, right. You want to get pregnant. I've seen so many people like my age or 30 starting to have to do IVF at like a seriously young age. Right.
And so this is a question I get a lot. And the research shows that there is no heightened risk of infertility from being on birth control long term. But so here's on the one hand, it's not related, but on the other hand, it is related. And that is that when you're on hormonal birth control, it allows you to continue to delay having children. And so when people are waiting because even though 29 seems so young to me, when you look at women's fertility peaks at 25, which is when it does peak, just seems way too young to be, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's like a baby having babies. And it's like your fertility is peaking is people are delaying fertility. And ultimately that, so delaying fertility is associated with a greater risk of infertility. But they've done a lot of studies and really thoughtfully done studies where they've tried to control for different things. And this isn't to say that it doesn't happen, because anytime that there's not a relationship, we don't know that this is related to that. That doesn't mean that it might not happen sometimes, but on the whole, on average, it seems like it doesn't. So.
Awesome. Sarah will be happy to answer more questions afterwards, I'm sure. But first, we want to give away some prizes.
Oh yeah, we have the raffle.
Let's hear it for Sarah.
Yeah, thanks guys.